we meet again. Welcome back. Well, hi, I'm Marc. Once upon a time, I used to work at Blizzard Entertainment, and now I teach art for a living. In this week's episode of my weekly series that I call YouTube Art School, I'll show you how I practice gesture drawing, or what I like to call the character artist art cardio, because you're probably doing it wrong. Also, why even practice this stuff? Oh yikes, quickly, let's get this class started. Alright, class is in session. Pay attention, you hear me? I'll be drawing a ton today as I explain the why and the how of gesture drawing. Some of it in real time and some of it sped up to keep the video at a decent length. And let's get right into it. First of all, why gesture drawing? What's the point really? This is something that I teach in my art program in the very first term, and there's good reasons. For art beginners, for those of you who don't have a whole lot of experience yet or no experience at all drawing, it's an amazing exercise to practice your observation skill, particularly selective observation, where you only focus on certain details and ignore the rest. As an artist, that's really the most important skill to develop, but it also helps practice spatial perception, which includes stuff like, locating points in space, determining the orientation of lines and objects, or assessing location in depth, all skills that apply to art in general, so very important stuff to focus on developing first. And gesture drawing helps with all of that. Wow. When you start to gain more experience though, you'll still get to practice all these same skills of course, but gesture drawing also helps as a fantastic visual library booster for poses, proportions, and anatomy. I make it a point to mention beginners and more advanced artists in two different groups because what you'll want to focus on when practicing gesture drawing will differ quite a bit depending on your experience level. In our case today, I'll focus more on experienced artists, like the way I practice. And if you're interested in this stuff, by the way, or simply interested in drawing anything you can imagine, check out my complete art education program where I cover all kinds of topics like gesture drawing in great details. You can also find a special coupon in the video description for a big discount on the program, and that's only valid until the end of the month. Don't miss out. Alright, now how to gesture draw. Let's get over a few important tips I find myself repeating often to my students. If you're a less experienced artist, usually I'll recommend you practice spotting the lines of action for your model, give pointers to help with body proportions, how to create simple mannequins, and techniques to measure distances between the different elements, etc. But instead, I'll try to explain what I focus on and explain my process as someone who's been practicing gesture drawing for well over a decade now. You should be able to follow this stuff no problem if you've been practicing gesture drawing for some months now, or more obviously. So what I've been doing so far are quick warm-ups, 1 minute each, and they're meant to just get me in the flow, get the engine started, And by the way, this little app that I'm using is something that I've used for the last like 6 years or so. It's called just gesture drawing in one word, and it allows you to select a folder and set up a gesture drawing session to your preference. Like different sessions with different time, with or without a timer. It has everything I need and it's awesome. I'll put an affiliate link in the video description if you're curious and you want to get it too. Anyways, I'm going to move on to longer 2-minute poses now. My bread and butter. Before I talk about anything else though, let's talk about the references that I have here. You might not think much of it, but the type of reference you use will make a huge impact on how well you'll be able to retain information, essentially how effective they are. What I always recommend is to use references that you can imagine yourself needing information from in the future. In other words, I always avoid references in crazy poses or extreme angles when I study. Just like you probably forgot a bunch of topics you learned in elementary school or high school because you couldn't see a point in learning them back then. It's kind of the same with art references. If you're working on a pose like this, for example, subconsciously your brain will just go, what is this? There's no way I'll need to retain this information. It'll never be useful in the future. So at least for me, I never draw poses like these from imagination, never had the need or the desire to, so I don't waste time studying it. Instead, I'll focus on poses that I'm way more likely to use in the future. As a result, I get to retain a lot more information from each of them, and I level up way faster. Epic hacks. Do it. And by the way, I'll also put affiliate links to these photo packs in the video description if you're curious where I get mine. They're awesome, and I highly recommend spending a few bucks on professional model photos if you can afford it. Like I said, better refs, better progress. It's science. Now, as I work on these gestures, I'm not trying to copy what I see. Like, I'm gonna guess is what 90 to 95% of artists do. That's completely fine as a beginner, no problem. But later on, no. Instead, I recommend that you construct your gestures using a simple mannequin, or at least roughly construct them. What's important to understand here, I guess, is I'm not trying to get good at gesture drawing as an art form. I don't care for the skill too much. Instead, I use gesture drawing to get better at drawing characters from imagination. There's a subtle difference there. The gesture drawing in my case is not the final product. It's always just meant as a study, something that I don't intend to share really, except now. What I'm looking for, or what I'm observing when I practice, is only the pose and the anatomy. That's pretty much it. When you construct a character with a mannequin, the proportions should already be figured out, and so I don't really need to observe them. My goal is not to draw this model here, only to use her pose and her anatomy. It's very specific. I showed you how I draw my character mannequins just a few weeks ago, so this is what I'm drawing here. Albeit, yeah, just a little simpler. You should give that video a watch if you haven't yet. My process will probably make a lot more sense once you have. Initially, I would probably recommend that you practice drawing the mannequin in a neutral pose first to get used to it and used to human proportions. Basically, practice this for a while until you can draw it from imagination, and then come back to gesture drawing like I do it here. I'm really just using the photo reference here to add detail to my mannequin, that's all. If we check, the proportions here aren't quite right. They're pushed a bit, but that's on purpose. They're just more ideal proportions defined previously when I constructed my mannequin. They're just proportions that I find more aesthetic. I can do what I want. Now, obviously, if you want to draw proportions that are more similar to the reference model, do that. I'm just saying that's not my goal here. For the quick poses that I worked on first during my warm-up, it was just a more simplified version of the mannequin where I was focusing more on the silhouette. Now, with double the time, I'm focusing a lot more on the volumes that make up the body. Different time limits, different focus. Anyways, to recap so far, choose your references carefully. It has a big impact on how fast you'll improve. Then warm up with some quick 1-minute poses, focusing on the silhouette of the model before moving on to the longer 2-minute poses where you'll want to focus more on the volumes that make up the body. Don't try to copy what you see. Instead, try constructing the body and its proportions, mostly from imagination, only glancing back at your reference when you need information about the pose and the anatomy of the model. We're inspiring ourselves from the reference, not copying it. In that sense, you can also exaggerate the pose if you feel confident enough. When you approach the study this way, when it's clear that the point is not to copy the reference, it's a lot more liberating and a lot more fun of an exercise, at least in my opinion. It's fine if it's not the same. Who cares? Finally, the last tip I have, and something else that I think has a big impact on the quality of the gesture, will be your treatment of the feet and the hands. Those often tend to affect the gesture a lot, so make sure you save some time for them. When the feet look wonky, especially the feet, your gesture drawings will usually look super floaty and kind of like off balance, and that can really ruin the whole thing. Practice drawing simple hands and feet separately with very few lines to get used to their construction if those are more problematic. I made another video showing my construction recipe for those two, for feet and hand, if you're curious, so have a look if you're not sure how to go about it. Finally, I'll just say that experience plays a big role in the speed of your gesture drawings. If 1 and 2 minutes is too short for you, like it was for me just a few years ago, then double the length you spend on these. It's not a race, but at the same time, you don't want to spend too much time, like no more than 5 minutes on any gesture unless you want to practice like shading it, because that takes more time. The goal is not to draw fast, it's to illustrate a lot with very few lines. It's to optimize your process and be able to do more with less time. This in itself will speed up your process. The speed is just a side effect of a more efficient gesture drawing. I'm sure there's a lot more I could optimize in my own gesture drawings, and well, that's why I keep practicing. And that's gonna wrap it up for this week's class. I think right about now would be a good time to pay the class fee of either 1 like or 1 sub, don't you think? My spies are watching you. If you did pay though, you get a bonus freebie. Oh my god. If you want the same brush I use for all of these drawings, you can find it in my free brush set. Link in the video description. They're all brushes that I use all the time. They're the best. We use them responsibly. Now, make sure you have notifications enabled to be on time for next week's class or our